You're, well, alive. So it would seem, Randolph replied. But I'd just like to say how very pleased I am to properly meet you, young William. I must say, I much prefer you now to when you were a baby. Much less drooly. This is impossible, Will said as Randolph hopped down off the bed and onto the floor. Yes, quite impossible, Randolph said, looking up at Will. But here we are. Will bent down and picked Randolph up, looking more closely at his old friend as he wriggled in his hands. I can see right up your nose, Randolph said as Will stared down at him. It must be something to do with this medallion, Will said, staring at the gemstone that was now flaring with bright green light. It must possess some sort of magical power. Well, its powers seem to be getting brighter, Randolph said as the medallion started spinning and emitting a high-pitched whining noise. And louder! The noise got more intense as the light got brighter and brighter, and then suddenly there was a loud popping sound and a rush of wind that felt as if something had sucked all the air out of the room. Chapter 2. Will let out a cry of alarm as he suddenly felt himself starting to fall, and then his cry was drowned out as he landed in a pool of murky water. He surfaced from the pool a second later with a spluttering cough. He took in his new surroundings, his eyes wide with surprise. He was standing in the middle of a swampy pond deep in a gloomy wood. The gaps between the trees surrounding them filled with shadows that sometimes seemed to move with a life of their own. Will heard a splashing sound behind him and span round to see a small figure draped in pondweed emerging from the smelly water. That was rather undignified, Randolph said, reaching up with one of his paws and removing some of the slimy weeds from his head. Where are we? Will asked, as the pair of them climbed out of the pond and onto dry land. A forest, Randolph said after surveying their surroundings for a moment. I can see that, Will said, as he helped Randolph to clean off the last of the sticky weeds. But how on earth did we get here? Magic and gravity, Randolph replied. In that order. Well, now we have to figure out how to magic ourselves back home again before Mum starts to worry, Will said, looking out into the murky woods that surrounded them in all directions. It's got to be something to do with that medallion. Yes, though it looks like its batteries might have run out, Randolph said, looking down at the mystical necklace that was still hanging round his neck. The bright green glow that had lit up Will's bedroom just a few moments earlier had faded away, and the gem at the centre of the medallion was now dark. Well, we can't just sit here, Will said. Let's see if we can find a way out of these woods. The pair of them set off walking as fast as they could between the rows of tall trees, their footsteps muffled by the deep bed of pine needles underfoot. As Will walked, he noticed that the trees surrounding them had perfectly square trunks with sharp corners, quite unlike the round tree trunks he'd grown up with. Wherever they had landed, it was becoming clear that it must be a very long way from home. Wait! Randolph said, stopping suddenly with the little semicircular ears on the top of his head twitching. Can you hear that? Will stopped and listened. At first he couldn't hear anything, but then somewhere in the distance he could make out the faint sounds of someone calling for help. It's coming from over there, Will said, pointing down a tiny path that forked off from the main trail. We'd better go and see if we can help. Chapter 3. Will hurried down the path towards the sound of the distressed voice coming from up ahead, with Randolph trotting as fast as he could along behind, doing his best to keep up. Suddenly, Will emerged into a forest clearing, where a bird covered in brightly coloured feathers was struggling to escape from a net made of sticky black vines.